Good morning, biology, and welcome to chapter 15, which is all about the theory of evolution. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about some early thought on evolution and kind of the background kind of information on the evidence for it. We'll talk about natural selection and all that stuff that you hear naturally associated with that word. So we're just going to jump right on in. Start out with the history of evolutionary thought. Uh, the man, the myth, the legend, Charles Darwin, lived from 1809 to 1882. He has some claim to evolutionary thought. He visited the Galapagos Islands, which is this group of islands here off of South America. Boop. They're a whole kind of chain of an archipelago out there. He noticed that animals on different islands looked very similar to each other, but looked like they were just a tiny bit different from each other. And he became convinced that organisms change over time and that these organisms had changed since their original state. This theory was called evolution, and this is the development of new organisms from pre-existing ones. And we find his findings as the theory of evolution. There's lots of evidence for it. There's lots of evidence that it's currently happening. Here are some examples of some different tortoises that he found on the different islands that had different kind of shell patterns and neck lengths and just kind of these variable traits. In Darwin's time, the ideas of the time were that all species were permanent and that they were unable to change, and that, two, Earth was only thousands of years old. And if you've taken my earth science, you know that we talked about Pangea and we talked about how the Earth has changed over the last 200 million years. There's lots of evidence for this, but at the time of Darwin, we hadn't found a lot of fossils, or we weren't able to radiometrically date rocks or figure out the age of anything. So we're kind of just, it was a whole bunch of guesswork at that point in time. But, so, after learning more, we have a kind of a deeper understanding and appreciation of the age of Earth. All right, some ideas about geology that kind of helped out here. In the 1800s, we started to study rock layers, started to find strata, and strata are these layers of rock that are deposited over time. Each one of these strips here is a new line of strata. Even there's a red strip between the two are new lines of strata. So as these were deposited one at a time, it tells us a lot. The ones at the bottom are older. They have been having things deposited on top of them longer. And as they started to go down, they started to find organisms in strata. This is a really fun time to give you my fun fact, is that the United States started in 1776. So George Washington, his presidency did not know that fossils existed. So it's kind of cool, kind of one of those weird historical timeline things. All right, our next dude is Georges Cuvier. He was a French anatomist, meaning that he studied the anatomy of organisms, their physical structures. And he was the first to reconstruct the appearance of organisms using fossil bones and kind of guessing what that organism had looked like. What he was finding is he gave some convincing evidence that some of the species that he found that were fossils are no longer alive today. He coined a word for these, and that these organisms had become extinct, meaning that they were no longer around on the Earth today. So, as he went through these different strata, he was finding different life. And so, as he went deeper and deeper, he noticed more and more different species. He also found that there'd be all these organisms together that were the same type of species or very closely related, and then all of a sudden it would just shift dramatically between the strata. And it seemed like it was happening all at once in the rock layers. Because of these sudden changes, he coined this theory called catastrophism, where we have sudden geologic catastrophes that cause the extinction of large groups of organisms at a certain time in Earth's past. So the asteroid event that is probable to have killed the dinosaurs is an example of such a catastrophe. Moving forward, we have Charles Lyell, who lived between 1797 and 1875, and he had this theory called uniformitarianism, where geologic processes that shape the Earth continue to do the same today. Weathering and the waves and the ocean currents, didn't just start once humanity started writing it down. These have been existing and happening long before us and will continue well into our future. So this book was among the collection that Darwin had on his trip to the Galapagos, and it provided a large part of his geologic argument for natural selection. Darwin wasn't the only one who had ideas on evolution at the time, though. You have John Baptiste Lamarck, and he is famously credited with these giraffe ideas, and he was in 1744 to 1829. And what he believed is that individuals could acquire traits during their lifetime. They didn't have to be passed on genetically. They could just be behavioral stuff. So this giraffe here, by stretching its neck further and further, it could reach higher up on the tree. And this could happen in one lifetime. So you could have a short giraffe and then all of a sudden have a long neck giraffe just because he stretched his neck so much farther each month or day or year of his life. Then, however, when the offspring was born, they would automatically start with this long neck. And then they could do the same thing and stretch their neck longer and longer, and you could end up with this really, really long neck giraffe. His idea, which was not quite how evolution works, was the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. And he had some parts right, like the fact that we can pass things off to our offspring, but it doesn't matter how hard I stretch my neck, I'm not going to turn into a giraffe-like creature in my lifetime. So Darwin's idea, which is a little more refined, was that, and both him and another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, formed a very similar theory on how evolution occurs. Both presented this information in 1858, but Darwin is kind of the creditor because he published his book first. And his book was on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And so, even though Alfred Russel Wallace also sailed the world and also had this kind of same basic idea of evolution, Charles Darwin just was a little bit quicker to the publish. And so he is the one who gets kind of the main credit. Darwin's book had two goals, and the first was to provide evidence that evolution occurs, and the second was to explain the variety and distribution of organisms on Earth in terms of natural processes that are observable today. So what the animals that we got today are because of the geological process that happened in the formation of today. So all four of these ant-eating objects here are related, but as they each got separated from Pangaea onto their own continent, they each kind of develop their own traits and kind of they look very similar, and do the same job, but live in different locations and are kind of more suited to each of those locations. Darwin's big claim is descent with modification, and that every organism alive must have originated from another species. So what this means is species have to be able to change over time. They have to be able to adapt to their environment. They have to be able to get new traits. On Galapagos, Darwin saw 13 different finches here. They all have very different beak shapes and sizes. This one's really small, this one's really big. But the thought that Darwin had was all these finches came back to a singular ancestor. And that singular ancestor was the one that all of these different finches had descended from. So Darwin also proposed a theory called natural selection, and this is the ability of an organism to have descent with modification. So what this means is as genes are passed down from parent to offspring, those offspring start to have a little bit different genetics than their parents, and then more different, they pass on different genetics, and eventually that population changes to something new. So this is a change in the alleles of a population. In this example here, the green beetles here are getting eaten by this bird. So the green alleles are going down, and you can see that the brown population is taking over. So eventually, this population will move from being around 50-50, 3 and 3 here, to now brown dominated. There is 4 main parts to natural selection, and we'll go over each of them. The first of these is overproduction, and simply put, this is that more offspring are produced than can survive to maturity. So not all rabbits can survive to maturity. Of these rabbits in this picture here, each of them would need food and protection to become an adult. But things in the environment will limit those populations. Some will get eaten, some will get sick, some will die young in childbirth. These limit the amount of births that happen or increase the amount of deaths that happen, that limit this population, which isn't naturally a bad thing. The second part of natural selection is genetic variation. In a population, individuals have different traits. So deer might have longer or thicker legs, or they might have thicker fur. These different butterflies here are different colors that could help them hide in different trees. These have to be traits that can be inherited. They have to be able to be passed down from parent to offspring. So occasionally we get these new traits that appear in populations. As you guys learned in our genetics kind of section, this is usually due to mutations. The next thing that organisms need is there has a struggle to survive for natural selection to occur. And in this, individuals will compete with each other for a chance to survive and a chance to reproduce. Some variations increase the odds of survival, things like on this bull here having horns to defend yourself. The longer you live, the more genes you theoretically can pass on. So a trait that makes an organism successful is called an adaptation. So an adaptation for these bulls might be that they have horns. The adaptation for this kind of bear-like creature might be that it has sharp teeth. The fourth part of natural selection is differential reproduction, and this is organisms with good adaptations will live longer and produce more young than organisms with bad adaptations or less favorable adaptations. Because the good adaptations are passing on more genes and the less good ones are passing on less, the population's allele frequency changes, and that's the whole thing about evolution, is this change in allele frequency. So more of the positive adaptation will be found in the population, and the population will start to change and be more like that original positive adaptation. What chooses the trait of differential reproduction? Well, it's the environment. The environment chooses which traits are useful. And Darwin used the survival of the fittest to describe this, but what we kind of mistake it for is just who can live the longest, but it has to be fitness. This is the measure of an individual's hereditary contribution to the next generation. It's not just living long, it's giving your genes to the next generation. So in this example here, this green beetle only has 2 children and then only has 4 grandchildren. So he passes on his genes, but not as much as this brown beetle, which is a higher fitness. He has 4 children, and each of them have 4 offspring. So now we have 16 of these offspring inside of the population instead of 4. So this population is moving towards this brown beetle kind of scheme there. Something that's similar to adaptation, but a little bit different, is acclimatization. And this is a short-term process in which physiological changes take place in a single organism in its single lifetime. So this is like one individual can grow fur because it's cold, longer fur, excuse me. But if it's an adaptation, this means that it's a change in the population over time, and each individual after that will have that adaptation. So here's another example of acclimatization. Salmon can start out in freshwater where there's no seawater here, and then as they get older, they can go through this change that they become acclimatized to seawater. And then this individual salmon is able to swim around in that seawater and live there. All right, starting 15.2 here, we have evidence of evolution. And the first thing is, and it's pretty compelling evidence, is the fossil record. And fossils are any remains or traces of an organism that died long ago. They can be animals, like this big old T-Rex above me, or they can be plants, like this pine tree right here. So some are from fossils that went extinct, like the T-Rex, and some are from animals or plants that still exist today. We still have pine trees today, and we can see some similarities between this one and current pines. The age of fossils is really important. It helps us tell a lot about the planet. And in 1669, Nicholas Steno kind of did this idea of superposition, and which is if you have rocks that haven't been disturbed, the older rock will be below the strata of the older rock, will be below the strata above it. So the older rock is closer to the bottom. Comparing fossils from around the world, we made this geological timescale here. And you've heard like of the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous periods with the dinosaurs, and we can see all of these fossils that were in that time period. And so this geologic meaning of the Earth, but also tying it to the fossils that were there. And what this does is this gives us relative age. It tells us the fossil's age compared to other fossils. If we find fossils right next to each other, we would probably assume that those ones are the same age and that they're younger than fossils that are below them, that are the older fossils. Absolute age is a little bit different. Absolute age is we can estimate the times of a rock's formation using radiometric dating. It's a little bit more precise. It's not as like kind of guessworky. But what it does is it allows us to that's when you see like dinosaurs walk the earth 200 million years ago. This gives us a more information for the fossil record, but the fossil record is incomplete because not all organisms leave behind fossils and not all fossils are easy to see. This here is a fossil. This picture is a fossil of a jellyfish. And using dating, we have kind of found out that this jellyfish fossil is from around 505 million years ago. So things that are soft-bodied like jellyfish tend to not leave behind very good fossils. Things like snails and the shells leave good fossils, but we don't see a lot of the organism that lived inside of it. All right, the distribution of fossils. So from the fossil record, we can make the following kind of educated statements. And the first is that different organisms lived at different times. These horseshoe crabs here and these shellfish here lived at different times. Today's organisms are different from those that lived in the past. Fossils that are closer together in strata look more alike. And observing fossils from when and where on the world provides evidences for their environment at the time and their adaptations that arose because of it. We see things called transitional species. These are species that have differed gradually in sequence over time, and they have both characteristics of the early animal and the current one. So whales are mammals. All mammals started out on the terrestrial planet, on the dry land, and this guy here is the ancient relative of whales and hippos. And as he started to live in the water more, he got these longer legs. They started to swim. He started to lose his tail because he didn't need it for balance. And eventually he became the whales that we see today. So over time, this four-legged creature returned to the water and kind of lost some of its original features, but each step along the way we can see these legs getting shorter and more flipper-like, and then all of a sudden the back legs are gone and we have big flippers in the front. These are all these transitional species between this original ancestor and the current one today, and the modern whale we see today. Biogeography, this is the study of locations of organisms around the world. So both Darwin and Wallace saw animals in very different areas that look similar. Looking at Australia is really fun because you see lots of mammals here, animals that resemble wolves, animals that resemble cats, mice, anteaters. The dingo looks kind of like a wolf. The sugar glider kind of looks like a squirrel. This guy looks like an anteater. The Tasmanian devil kind of looks like, something we have around here. The dugong looks like the manatee. So most Australian mammals are marsupials, animals that carry young in their pouches. So like the kangaroo will put the young in its pouch. So we think that most of the mammals on Australia originated from a single ancestor. The same one probably that opossums came from as well. All right, anatomy and embryology also give us some clues towards relatedness. Anatomy is the study of the body structures of organisms, and embryology is the study of how organisms develop. So looking at like these timelines here of shark, lizards, chicken, pigs, and humans, and how they develop in the womb, kind of gives us some evidence for, we see that these processes are kind of similar, because we're all well, except for the shark, we're all vertebrates. We all have a backbone, so you can see these kind of backbony stages with eyes, and see how that changes and how it's the same and different. But the takeaway here is that organisms who have similar anatomy and who develop the same way are probably related. They probably are more related than organisms that have different anatomy and develop differently. So the forelimbs of animals give us some really nice evidence. Things like penguins, humans, alligators, bats, cats all have these same bones in their forearm. These bones are used very differently. For porpoise, it's swimming. For bat, it's flying. For cat, it's pouncing. For humans, it's typing, using tools. For horse, it's like running around. But all of these came from a singular organism, the ancestral organism here. We'd like draw these all back. Bloop, 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 bloop. Who had these bones. And then these bones kind of changed over time in different populations and became what they are today. We call these structures homologous structures. Homo meaning same, and logos meaning origin, so same origin. So these are structures in different species that originated from a common ancestor. And they differ from those things called analogous structures. Things like bats and things like insects both have wings. They both fly with them. They're not related closely, however. So we call them analogous structures. These are structures that have the same function, even though they have very different ancestors. Bats and insects haven't been closely related for millions and millions of years. We also see some things in the fossil record called vestigial structures, and these are structures that seem to serve no function in modern animals, but resemble structures that had functional roles in related animals. So for humans, we have the thing called the coccyx, which is your tailbone. We don't have a tail anymore, but we still have the coccyx. We have the appendix, which no longer has a function. There's some scientists that believe it has a small function, but not a necessary function anymore in humans. It used to, and it does in some of our simian relatives. And the second example here is these pelvic bone in whales. These guys still have these pelvic bones like they should have legs, but they don't grow legs anymore. They have lost the ability to grow legs, and they still have not yet got rid of the ability here to grow those bones. So they still have the bones, even though they have no legs. They're not connected to anything. Biological molecules also give us some really good insight into the history of evolution. Organisms that share more traits should have a more common ancestor. We know that DNA and RNA are the tools we use to pass on inheritance from one organism to the other. By comparing DNA, we can see how closely related organisms are, and we can see how far long ago their DNA split and changed. So, our developing theory on evolution is a modern synthesis approach, where we take natural selection and we add it to Mendel's genetics to create this kind of idea of how organisms adapted from one another. And we use a tool called phylogeny, which is the relationships by ancestry among groups of organisms. So all of these vertebrates here, lungfish, amphibians, mammals, lizards, crocodiles, ostriches, and hawks, all came from the same common ancestor. But each time you see a little purple dash here, something changed. We got limbs, so these guys have legs and these guys don't. We got amnion, meaning that we have like the placenta and like kind of the ability to make eggs. We got feathers down here for birds. None of these other groups have feathers, just these ones. So each time you see a little dash, that is a trait that has arose in that new population. So we make these to show the relatedness between organisms, to see the passage of traits through organisms, to see the kind of the evolutionary history between organisms. All right, so looking at these phylogenetic trees here, kind of trying to read them. The trunk here is the ancestral animal, and then each branch off of that trunk is a separate lineage or population. If things are closely related, like these ostriches and hawks and other birds, they are closer together on the branch. As you move further and further away, birds are less related to amphibians than they are to crocodiles, say, or lizards, or even mammals. So this kind of gives you a look at this. You can see who is closely related to who. All right, for our last kind of topic here, evolution is not a static process. It is still happening today. So it is occurring all the time, and it still is animals that are more adapted to an environment will still be more fit in that environment. And eventually, organisms change and do not resemble their ancestral forms. So this guy down here, the Dawn horse, he is the original ancestor to horses, we think. He's got these like kind of toes. As horses have changed throughout the years, this is also the kind of modern ancestor to zebras. But as they change, you can see that their foot changes, their size changes. They kind of get from this forward-leaning posture to a little bit like higher head with a bigger, neck kind of thing. So this modern horse looks a lot different than this ancestral one. Convergent evolution, this is when we take analogous structures, things like insects' wings and bird wings, and we go through convergent evolution where different species evolved similar traits. So both birds and bats fly, and they both eat insects, but they have different ancestors. So we call this convergent evolution because they look similar, they do similar things, but they don't have similar ancestry. Now, divergent evolution is the opposite. This is where the descendants of a single ancestor diversify into species that fit different parts of the environment. So, first example is this elephant and this mammoth here. They have a common ancestor who's no longer alive, but one of them split to live more in the tropical areas, and one of them became more of the cold weather survivalist. Another example is cats and dogs. Dogs and cats are very closely related, but dogs are omnivores, meaning they eat both plants and animals. So they have a different kind of neological niche. And then cats are carnivores. They eat just meat. So they kind of develop different adaptations and traits to get there. Cats have sharper teeth, retractable claws. They're able to track their prey. They're better hunters, etc. The next thing is adaptive radiation. This is this process where if a new population of animals is introduced to a new environment, they will undergo divergent evolution quickly until their population fills many parts of the environment. And this happens to reduce competition. So instead of the common ancestor, which was eating one thing, now we have a group of them that are just eating insects, some that are just eating seeds, some that are just eating cactuses, and some that are just eating buds and fruits. Now there is more food available for these different species, and they are able to more of them survive and more of them pass on genetics and continue to diversify and make new species. Right, artificial selection, this is the process where a human breeder chooses the individuals to parent the next generation. This is how we form species of dogs, corn, horses, citrus fruit. This is how we got broccoli and cauliflower. But with dogs, we took the gray wolf and we bred the characteristics that we wanted. The colors, the shapes, the demeanor, all of that was determined by early breeders to make these new dog species. The last topic is coevolution, when two or more species have evolved adaptations to each other's influence. So in the example 1 here, these flowering plants evolved pollen to help insects help them reproduce. This guy here, this is the buff-tailed sicklebill hummingbird and the centropogon flowers. They're both in the Amazon rainforest. But this guy's beak is designed to get down here and get nectar from the bottom. And as he does, this little pollen granule thing here dusts his head with pollen, which he carries to the next flower and then helps in that reproduction of that next flower. So these two have evolved together. This guy to have a beak shape that fits in there, and this flower to have a pollen thing to get that guy to pollinate him. We have modern coevolution between us and bacteria. As we develop new and better antibiotics, bacteria are evolving new and better defenses against them in a coevolutionary, what we call arms race, where both things are trying to figure out how to beat the other one, and we're evolving together. So as you get older and older, you'll see less and less medications work because bacteria will start to be better and better adapted against fighting them. So this is the conclusion of Chapter 15. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.